Hello everyone, welcome to your lesson 2. This is part A of lesson 2, and the title for this lesson is The Rise of Liberalism. Liberalism is a word you are going to hear about a lot in this course. All right, so liberalism is an ideology. All right, so let's go back to lesson 1. In lesson 1, you learned about the ideological spectrum, right? So this is the spectrum on which we place different ideologies. Some ideologies are more individualist, so we place them on the right side of the spectrum. Some ideologies are more collectivist, so we place them on the left side of the spectrum. Well, liberalism, this ideology that we're learning about today, is an ideology that can be placed on the right side of the spectrum. It is an individualist ideology, and so the principles of individualism could really also be called the principles of liberalism. All right, so that's what we're going to be learning about today. Today we learn about how this first ideology, well, it's not the first ideology, but the first ideology that we learn about in class, how it came to be. All right, so, what were the roots of it, and we're going to explore the rise of it. And so in this lesson, we're going to be learning about the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and we're going to Enlightenment. So let's get into it. Let's start things off with the Middle Ages. So everything that is blue is what you're going to want to write down in your partial notes. So you should have your partial notes with you as you watch the video. And the first box, or the first section in your lesson 2, is all about the Middle Ages. All right, Middle Ages are also known as, so AKA means also known as. They're also known as the medieval period, or some people call them the Dark Ages, although some professors of the Middle Ages or Middle Ages historians might not appreciate calling them the Dark Ages, but that is a term that is sometimes used to refer to the Middle Ages. So what was life like in the Middle Ages? Well, you probably remember seeing this feudal pyramid in Social 20, right? So we had different social classes in European society at the time, right? And by the way, this lesson is very much focused on Western European history. All right, that's just the way it's going to go for today. All right, so what do we got? We have the people who are in the lowest social class do not have very many privileges in European society in the Middle Ages. And then we have the upper classes of society who have many privileges. And then at the very top of it all, we have the king or the queen who typically has absolute control over society and has absolute power. Okay, that's life in the Middle Ages. All right, so Middle Ages begin sort of, towards the mid to late, what would that be, 5th century, right? So, I mean, we could take it all the way back to 476 when the Roman Empire collapses and Europe is thrown into chaos, right? Under the Roman Empire, there was stability, there was order. However, when the Roman Empire collapses, well, now there is relative chaos, there is no structure, there's no stability. And so local warlords start establishing control over bigger and bigger groups of people, and they start calling themselves kings. And so what we end up with is a feudal society, a society that we call feudalism, where a king has military control over its own people and gives special privileges to an elite social class of people who help the king preserve control over the lower classes, right? And so because of this, there started to be larger pockets of order, of stability, because of the control that kings and queens established over the people that they conquered. Common people, in this case, were given security, right? Because there used to be chaos and disorder. Well, now the commoners, the people at the bottom of the pyramid, what they received was security and stability. And in return, they gave their service to their lords, right? To the aristocrats, who were the privileged people in society, and also, of course, to their king, who had absolute control and was infallible, right? But the individual lives of each commoner, right, each of the people here at the bottom of the pyramid, their lives were pretty much meaningless and worthless in the eyes of the greater society. Okay, so we get into the Middle Ages, and by about the 800s, most of Europe now had adopted Christianity as its majority religion. And there was no separation between church and state, right? So um, the monarchs and the Christian church, right, the Catholic Church, they were one and the same, right? They're very much fused together, and there was no division between the two. And so the monarchs used religion to maintain control over their subjects. And the people at the bottom of the pyramid, they were promised that your life on earth is not going to be great, right? However, if you obey the rules of religion and if you obey the rules of your monarch, well, then when you die, you will go to heaven, right? So for the people at the bottom of the pyramid, their life on earth was not really their focus. Their life on, or rather, their focus was on the afterlife and receiving the glory of heaven after they die. And there were Catholic theologians who even argued that the kings, here at the top of the pyramid, that their power was given to them by God himself, right? That God had chosen them to be the king of their people. Right? So we see at this point no separation between the government and religion, right? Church and state. So during the Middle Ages, now we can get into your partial notes again. There was less focus on the material world, right? That is the world that we live in. The material world is here we are right now, the material world. And there was more focus on the afterlife. And developments in art, science, commerce, progress in general, those types of things, they were not emphasized, right? So the common belief at the time was that, this was just the natural state of things, right? It was natural to have a king. It was natural to have different social classes who had different amounts of privilege and power in society. It was assumed that that was natural. And people did not really care so much about science. They didn't care so much about trying to make life better either, right? This idea of progress was not really emphasized. It wasn't really something that people tried to focus on. Here's a quote from a man who has studied the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment period. And here he is describing life in the Middle Ages and the beliefs of people in the Middle Ages. He says, spells of bad weather were blamed on witches or angry sky-dwelling gods. Oceans and forests were the domain of evil beasts, and scores of people were tortured in the name of religion. Right. So at the time, the Middle Ages, this kind of shows you how little people understood about the world, that they didn't actually know much about the natural world, the world that they were living in. So during the Middle Ages, the importance of each individual person in society was very small, right? So one person, if they died, it wasn't a big deal, right? It was not something that people really, cared about too much as a society, right? Especially the people who were in the lower social class. And citizens were part of the feudal system, where they fit into distinct categories or social classes. So in today's world, at least in many countries like Canada, we see that each human life has dignity and is worthy of respect, right? However, at the time, those assumptions did not exist, right? It was not assumed that each person's life had worth and meaning. Right? So we see this in the art of the Middle Ages, right? The art of the Middle Ages did not really focus on trying to portray humans in an accurate way. Instead, the art of the Middle Ages was very much focused on symbolism, religious symbolism. There was no art of just a regular person. Instead, art was meant to depict the saints and the heavens, and even the pictures of the saints themselves, they were filled with symbolism instead of trying to be an accurate representation of what the person actually looked like. Okay, so what we've been talking about so far, all of that has been in the Middle Ages, right? And this is approximately from, roughly the year 500 to the year 1300. So hopefully this timeline is a bit helpful for you. Now we're going to go into a period called the Renaissance, and you're going to see that there was an increasing focus on individualism in these second and third time periods that we're studying today. That increasing focus on individualism was very small in the Renaissance period. It really picked up more in the Enlightenment period. But let's learn about the Renaissance a little bit. So the next section of your notes, the title is the Renaissance. If you know any French, you might know that Renaissance means rebirth, right? So it was a time of renewed interest in the individual. More people became educated and they owned books. So the Renaissance period begins when many Islamic scholars fled the Ottoman Empire in 1453, and they brought some ancient Greek texts with them. So there were some ancient Greek texts that were focused on the importance of individuals, that were somewhat humanistic and focused on democracy as well, and were focused on logic and inquiry and reason. And those had been largely lost by European society. However, when the Ottoman Empire breaks up, those texts are brought back to Western Europe. And there is a rebirth of reason and logic and caring about the worth of the individual. So there's a renewed interest in Greek and Roman culture with their focus on the importance of the individual. Okay, and so we see a difference in art, right? The art now focuses on humans, right? It now focuses on nature, not just saints and heavens. It's no longer only focused on religion. It's focused on regular people. Well, I shouldn't say regular people. For the most part, it was more focused on wealthier people, higher class individuals. However, people were still living in the feudal system, okay? So they still had a king, they still had a queen, they still had social classes. You were a commoner. Yeah, your life didn't improve that much during the Renaissance. We're still in this period right here. We have not made it any further into the future. But let's talk about a period called the Protestant Reformation, because this gives us an increased focus on individualism as well. So Protestant Reformation, in the 1500s, 1600s, and it began with this man over here. His name was Martin Luther, and he challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. See, at the time, and still today, the Catholic Church interprets God's teachings for the people, right? And the Catholic Church establishes a set of teachings and beliefs, and if you are Catholic, well, then you believe those things, right? However, Martin Luther and then many other Protestants after him claimed that it's possible for one person to read the Bible and to understand God's messages by themselves. That it's not necessary to have the church teach us what God believes, that it's possible for each individual person to read scripture and to establish for themselves what God's message is for them. Right? So you can see how this is a more individualist approach to religion. Right? And so because of the Protestant Reformation, there's a greater focus on the ability of individuals to make choices for themselves. And then we also have the printing press. The printing press is a huge deal, very, very big deal. The Bible can now be translated and distributed to way more people, right? So more people gained access to the Bible. So then people could explore, consider, and interpret their faith on a more personal level. And they were able to read scripture themselves and did not rely on the teachings of church authorities in order to understand God and understand their faith. Okay, so what do we see in the Renaissance? We see individualism emerged very slowly, right, over several centuries. However, those rigid social classes, they continued to play a significant role in societal structure, right? So, if you were a commoner, you remained a commoner during this time. Okay, let's talk about economics for a moment. Which economic system was prominent in Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance? You might remember from Social 10 that the economic system was called mercantilism, right? So in your partial notes where it says economic system of the time, you can write mercantilism. What do you remember from Social 10 about mercantilism? Well, in a mercantilist economy, the king or the queen has full control over the economy. And there is no competition. There's no open competition between different businesses. Instead, the king or the queen can give authority to one company to have a monopoly over a certain industry, right? And then that one company, they give a large portion of their profits to the king or to the queen, right? And so this allows the king or the queen to keep control over the economy and to keep making themselves very wealthy, right? So that's the Renaissance. Now let's talk about the Enlightenment. So if you turn the page of your partial notes, you will get to the Enlightenment. And so you see all sorts of fancy stuff going on in the Enlightenment. I mean, just look at all the science that's happening right here, right? Just tons of science, right? So you're going to see that science becomes very important in the Enlightenment. It's also known as the Age of Reason, right? So you've got your timeline here on the right side. That is the Enlightenment from the 1600s to the late 1700s. And we see an ever-increasing focus on individualism. So Immanuel Kant says, enlightenment is humankind's emergence from its self-incurred immaturity, its lazy and cowardly submission to the dogmas and formulas or religious or political authority. Enlightenment's motto is dare to understand. Right? So now people are going to try to understand the world that they live in. There are four main themes of the Enlightenment, as you see in your partial notes. They are reason, science, humanism, and progress. You can label those in the blank spaces that are left for you in your partial notes. And we're going to go through each one of these and understand them. So let's talk about reason. Well, along with religious faith, scholars and philosophers focused on logic and reasoning to support the teachings of the church. Okay, so it's no longer only important to have blind faith. It's also important to try to use logic and reason to understand God and understand the teachings of the church. This is a time of science, right? This is the time of the scientific revolution. We learn, people create the scientific process. Empiricism becomes important. This is the time where we seek to understand the world that we live in, right? And also outside of our world, right? They try to understand the universe at this time as well, right? So science, we see developments in mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, and chemistry. And they transform the views of society about nature. And before, people did not understand the world at all. And now people are starting to understand how the world works more and more. Okay, next, humanism. Humanism is the belief that human beings have value and deserve freedoms. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal. That's a very radical idea at the time. This idea that all humans are deserving of freedoms. So this is a time where there was a terrible, terrible slave trade happening. You learned about the slave trade in Social 10, right? The transatlantic slave trade, where people were enslaved and treated essentially like livestock, right? This was chattel slavery, a particularly brutal form of slavery that was being used throughout the colonies in the Americas. And it was really the ideas of the Enlightenment that led to the end of this, because the Enlightenment now believed in something called progress. This was the belief that if we make advances in technology, if we make advances in science, and if we make advances in social organization, right, the way we organize ourselves in society, we can actually improve the human condition, right? So if we go back to the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages, people were taught that your focus should be on the afterlife, right? Try to make sure that you live a good life now so that you can have a good life in the afterlife. However, with the Enlightenment, we change that a bit. All of a sudden, people become interested in making life better here on Earth. And part of that is making the lives of enslaved people better, right? And so this is the beginning of the abolition movement, where people with humanistic ideas of human dignity, start to say, no, you know what? Slavery is not natural. Slavery is not the way things need to be. We can get rid of slavery. We can change our social organization to make the human condition better, right? And then also we can invent new things, right? So this was a time of many inventions, or in this case, attempted inventions to try to make life better here on Earth. Okay? And then this was also a time of Enlightenment philosophers. Philosophers shared some new ideas. They said that each individual person matters, right? That's important. That's something that we take for granted today, but it was a revolutionary idea at the time. And reason, but not religion, should be our source of knowledge. And each individual is reasonable and capable of governing himself, right? And that we don't necessarily need to have a big scary king or queen ruling over us. It's possible to even allow people to govern themselves. Well, which form of government are we talking about here? We're talking about democracy, right? So we see people start becoming interested in democracy again, right? All right, so you guys are going to learn about these Enlightenment philosophers. Sometimes we call them Enlightenment thinkers. So you can see the next section in your partial notes is all about these different Enlightenment philosophers. So what I'm going to get you to do is spend a bit of time going through the textbook. I'll post some chapters of the textbook in D2L to help you out. Otherwise, you can use the textbook in class if you are in class. And you can fill in the boxes of the notes. So let me see here. Can I pull up your notes? It's the wrong thing. Give me a second here and I will get your notes up on the screen and I will show you how it's done. So these are your Unit 1 notes. Here we go. All right, so for each of these thinkers, I want you to look at their view on human nature, right? So what do they believe about humans? Do they think humans are good or bad? Do they think humans are smart or not very smart, right? So write a couple sentences about each of these guys saying what they believed about human nature. And then what do they think should be the role of government in society? What kind of government do we need? What kind of government should we have according to each of these guys? So I already did Thomas Hobbes for you. He believed that humans are violent, we are greedy, we are selfish, right? And we are willing to hurt others in order to get what we want. Well, that's not a very good view of humanity, right? He didn't think humans were all that great. And so he believed that we needed to have a very strong government that maintained security, that prevented us from hurting each other. Okay, so I already did his for you. Now find out what John Locke believed about humans and what kind of government did he believe that we need, right? And then do the same for the rest of the guys. Where it says the social contract, you can leave the social contract blank. I'm going to go over that with you in class. So don't worry about that one. Unless you come across an answer, then feel free to write it down. But I don't think you will. Montesquieu, he is not in the textbook. So there's a document about him in D2L in the Unit 1 section of D2L. So you can get your answers there. Voltaire, he's only got the one page. There is not a lot about Voltaire. So if you only write a little bit, that's okay. John Stuart Mill, you'll have no problem with him. Same with Rousseau, you should be good with him. And Adam Smith, there's lots on him, so I left lots of space. Okay, but I want you to leave some space in each of these squares. Okay, so don't fill up the square entirely as you do your textbook work. Yeah, so here we go. Don't fill in boxes completely. Leave some space because I'm probably going to give you some extra things to write in there later on. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. Good luck to each and every one of you. Start working on those Enlightenment philosophers. Let me know if you have questions. Have a good day.